going to give you a kind of abbreviated history of U.S. foreign policy in the early republic. And that will lead us up to the kind of main event for today, which is the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. I'll start by laying a little bit of background for the foreign policy of the early republic before we get to that point. So let me start with something that's very simple, but also very important in any discussion of U.S. foreign policy. If there's only one thing that I would have you take from this course when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, if you could only remember one thing, it would be this: the United States has never been an isolationist nation. Never in any meaningful sense of the word has this country been isolationist. The foreign policy debates that have occupied the United States from the Revolutionary War and the foundation of the Republic through the 21st century have not been about whether the United States should engage with the rest of the world, but rather on what terms that engagement should take place. Now, discussions of American foreign policy often begin with the assumption that it came about as some sort of, miraculous, almost virgin birth, right? That one day, poof, here's this new nation, the United States, that comes out of nowhere and begins to chart its path on the world stage. And of course, it is true that the United States was a new independent nation after 1776, or if you want to date it to the actual signing of the treaty, 1783. But as you'll know from having paid attention to the first half of this course, American leaders and the American people didn't just appear spontaneously out of nothing on July 4th, 1776. Before they were Americans, folks like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, before they were Americans, they were British. And as such, they were conscious of their place in a larger British Empire prior to the break. Virtually all of the founding fathers, right, the folks who go to lead the revolutionary generation and then the sort of early years of the Republic, began their careers as supporters of the idea of empire in general and the British Empire in particular. It was the kind of clumsy British handling of that empire. Things like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and that dumbass Thomas Hutchinson that had led them towards independence. It was not an abstract objection to the idea of empire, right? They have come to oppose their place within the British Empire, but that did not mean they were opposed to the notion of empires. And the point here is that the United States was birthed out of a larger struggle within the British Empire, and thus Americans, and particularly the American elite, were accustomed to thinking in global terms from the very beginning of this nation. Despite what some of their social betters in England might have thought, these were not country bumpkins, but rather worldly statesmen with a good understanding of empire and foreign policy from the very beginning. And in fact, one of the reasons I have this picture on this slide here is that one of the developments that made possible the existence of American victory in the Revolutionary War was the work of Benjamin Franklin, who you see there in the center, crafting the 1778 Treaty of Alliance with France. Right, the United States has to be engaged in foreign policy from the very beginning. It had to do that in order to win its independence. And of course, as I mentioned for you already, the new nation is surrounded by much larger imperial powers on all sides from the very beginning, right? So the British to the north and also to the east in the Caribbean, and the Spanish to the west and the south, as well as the fact that Native American groups are now being treated as independent nations as well. And so diplomacy with foreign nations is absolutely, it's vital. It's not something that the United States could choose to forego even if it wanted to. And as I already discussed, one of the major motivating factors in creating a strong national government to replace the Articles of Confederation was the belief that Americans needed such a government in order to assert itself on the world stage, right? So Alexander Hamilton, who, as you know, was an advocate of strong national government for a variety of reasons. Well, one of those reasons was as follows: no government, he said, could give us tranquility and happiness at home, which did not possess sufficient stability and strength to make us respectable abroad. Um, you see here from the very beginning the kind of logic of empire, right? That we can't even be happy at home. It's not even possible for us to be happy at home unless we are strong and projecting power abroad. That's not an inevitable thing to think. You don't need to think that. I don't happen to think that. Hamilton did, though, and really the entire founding generation, despite their disputes on many issues, did believe that the United States needed to have a strong foreign policy presence in order to guarantee not just the security of the republic, but also its success. Now, U.S. foreign policy in the early years of the Republic took a variety of forms, from economic to cultural to military engagement with foreign nations and groups. But the single most important factor in early U.S. foreign policy was territorial expansion, right? And this sort of simple fact that I have here on the slide, that the size of the United States roughly tripled from 1790 to 1880. From these kind of 13 colonies pinned in on the Atlantic coast to, by 1880, stretching across the North American continent. And this territorial expansion has often been treated, and you sort of know about this. If you took any U.S. history class, you realize we started as 13 colonies and ended up being what you see here. It's often treated as an incident in domestic policy, simply because it took place here on the North American continent and on what would eventually become the domestic boundaries of the United States. But there's nothing inevitable about this second map, about this 1880 map, just as there's nothing inevitable about the 1790 map, right? We talked about the various factors and contingencies that produce that result. There's also nothing inevitable about the United States as a nation spanning the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in fact, the process by which the United States conquered, and I think that is exactly the right word, conquered the continent, was a textbook case of an activist foreign and military policy that entailed the use of force, diplomacy, threats, bribes, and promises that matched the most Machiavellian practices of old world European diplomacy. This expansion entailed not only the use of diplomacy and military force against Native Americans, which is something we've talked about from the very beginning, but also against a number of European nations, as well as we will see later today, as against the newly independent nation of Mexico, and starting in the 1830s. American leaders were virtually unanimous in supporting an aggressive policy of territorial expansion from the very beginning, right? When we talked about all the various disagreements they had, right, about how it's hard to talk about any kind of notion of original intent, when the very guys who signed the Constitution or Declaration of Independence didn't agree on what it meant from the very beginning, and often fought bitterly with each other. One thing they agreed on, though, was supporting an aggressive policy of territorial expansion. Thomas Jefferson argues during his lifetime for seizing not only Florida and Cuba, which at least you can see as being, relatively territorially close to the 13 colonies, but also Canada. He looks around and he says, with Europe distracted, right? So Europe in the early years of the 19th century is being roiled by the Napoleonic Wars, which we'll talk about in a minute, Napoleon and the new French Empire. And so Jefferson says, hey, Europe's distracted. All these European empires that are claiming territories in the Americas are distracted. We're going to take Florida, we're going to take Cuba, and we're going to take Canada. And when that happens, he says, we will have, in his words, such an empire for liberty as has not been surveyed since the creation. I am persuaded no constitution was ever before so well calculated as ours for extensive empire and self-government. By enlarging the empire of liberty, we provide new sources of renovation should its principles at any time degenerate in those portions of our country which gave them birth. Notice the interesting phrase there, empire for liberty, right? Those are words, empire and liberty, that we don't normally associate with one another. We oftentimes see them as opposed. But Jefferson believed that the United States could expand territorially, create a vast empire, and still remain a beacon of liberty. Nor were these just words, right? The most significant foreign policy legacy of the Jefferson administration, right? Jefferson's elected in 1800, he serves 2 terms. Um, his major foreign policy legacy are 2 events that I'm sure you have heard of before, but again, have usually been classed or usually discussed, particularly in, say, a high school textbook, in the realm of domestic policy. But I'm going to argue for you today that these are absolutely parts of his foreign policy legacy. And those are the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 and the Lewis and Clark Expedition of 1804 to 1806. Now, on its face, Jefferson might seem an odd choice to lead the United States on a path of empire and expansion, right? After all, it's Hamilton who is the kind of hard-boiled, aristocratic, Machiavellian political operative, right? Jefferson is all about the kind of simple agrarian lifestyle, the nobility of the small white farmer, right? Simple Republican virtue. Ironically, however, it was Jefferson's very attachment to the simple life of the white farmer and the belief in the kind of the fundamental virtuousness of that lifestyle and its centrality to the American project that led him to push the United States towards the path of conquest and war in the West. Jefferson believed that the United States must remain a rural nation. Only citizens who owned and worked their own land had the independence to decide political questions fairly. Right, and of course, this all goes back to a slide you've seen like 18 zillion times before, and it's as boring now as it was then in many ways, but it's also incredibly important, right? This notion that only people who own their own land have the ability to be virtuous and independent, and therefore to be good citizens of the republic, right? How do we stay a rural nation, though, right? As our population grows, and right, population growth is one of the huge parts of the American story, both through self-reproduction, through immigration, and also through the slave trade up to 1808. How do we maintain ourselves as a nation of small white landholders as our population grows, right? And as cities like New York spring up on the West Coast, Jefferson hates big cities, right? Well, for Jefferson and those who believed in this particular vision, the great hope was that the vast American continent would allow American society to spread out slowly and remain an agricultural republic. Essentially, that we would expand through space rather than developing over time into this kind of debauched and decadent urban nation like Britain, right? And so while Hamilton looks east to trade in the model of Great Britain, Jefferson looks west, right? And again, it's here that Madison's ideas about large and small republics come into play, right? We talked about the sort of innovation that he had, that Madison has, that previously it had been believed that, you need to have small republics because that's the only way you can get people to agree on things. Well, the experience of the early post-revolutionary years led Madison and many of his fellow founding fathers to say, hey, look, it's not actually good when people agree on things because people are bad, and they can get together and tyrannize their betters like me. And actually, large republics are good because the interests will cancel each other out and will create a kind of more distant form of government ruled by elites like me, right? So both the kind of federalist and anti-federalist traditions in their own ways are contributing to this notion of a big republic being good, of expanding being a good thing, right? The means by which Jefferson was willing to go to secure this empire of liberty, right, are best illustrated by his handling of the Louisiana Purchase. So prior to 1801, this is kind of, say like 1800, Jefferson takes office. This map is what things look like, right? That the area to the west of the Mississippi River is controlled by Spain. And Americans are already eyeing this land, figuring, hey, this is going to be we'll be taking that. That's going to be ours, right? We're going to expand it. But they weren't in any particular hurry, and they weren't really worried about Spain because Spain is perceived to be at the time a kind of decadent, weak, decaying empire. Part of that is a kind of cultural chauvinism and religious chauvinism against Catholics and against, kind of decadent Spanish Mediterranean types, right? But it also has some truth in it, and that Spain really was a declining empire. Well, it wasn't because they were Catholic, but the Spanish Empire had kind of run its course when it was in its decline phase. So Americans were looking at it going, you know what, we'll take this when we're ready, right? We'll consolidate our gains here east of the Mississippi, and we're ready. We'll push the Spanish aside, like before. But in 1801, Spain is so weak that they agree to sell off all of what is labeled there as Spanish Louisiana to this guy, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon, who was taking a break from the wars that we know by his name in Europe, hoped to use these new territories, Spanish Louisiana, to help supply the sugar colonies of the Caribbean, right? So Haiti and places like Guadeloupe and Martinique are these French-controlled islands in the Caribbean. These are what Napoleon actually valued. Why? Because they grow sugar there, and sugar is almost as good as gold, right? But these are also not places that are really well supplied. They need food, they need other supplies that they're not producing because those islands are just producing sugar. And so the idea is to create this kind of new French crescent, right? We talked about that previous French crescent that stretches from Louisiana here down through Haiti and the islands like Guadeloupe and Martinique. And the Spanish Louisiana would be kind of the bread basket, would be the part that generated the food that would then be shipped to these islands, right? However, for Jefferson and many Americans, this is very alarming because it's one thing to have France own this territory. It's one thing to have Spain own this territory. Spain's weak. We can push them around. We'll take it when we want it. A powerful French empire under Napoleon, however, that's another story. Those are not someone you want as neighbors, and they're not going to be easy to push around when your time comes to seize that territory. So this suddenly becomes a matter of great concern now that France controls this territory. And it's not so much about these islands, right? Yes, we'll take those eventually, thanks Jefferson, but it's really about Louisiana. So when this story usually gets told in your high school textbooks, we skip straight from the French taking control in 1801 to 1803 when Napoleon agrees to sell all of this vast territory for $15 million, right? So you see there's this map, Louisiana Purchase. This is the territory that the French sell to Jefferson and the United States for then 15 or about the equivalent of 250 million US dollars, a bargain. Unanswered in this, though, is the question of why, right? I mean, Napoleon just bought this stuff in 1801. Why would he turn around and then sell it to Jefferson in 1803? This was not a straightforward financial transaction. And in fact, Jefferson took 3 steps in those 2 years, from 1801 to 1803, in order to pressure Napoleon into selling the Louisiana territory. And the first had to do with the Haitian Revolution, right? This is a revolution led by enslaved Africans and their descendants in Haiti against their French overlords. It begins in 1701. It's associated with Toussaint Louverture, and continues to 1804 when Haiti eventually wins independence. Now, Jefferson is obviously himself a slave owner and was president of a slaveholding nation, right? Therefore, he absolutely publicly has to be against the Haitian Revolution, right? You can't, as a slaveholder and president of a slaveholding republic, you cannot be in the business of encouraging slave rebellions. But this particular rebellion actually serves Jefferson's causes. One, because it's keeping the French distracted at the very least, right? They're tied down in Haiti. And 2, if this revolution were to succeed and the French were to get kicked out of Haiti, and lose access to all that sugar, well, they would be much more amenable than to maybe selling the Louisiana, because the whole reason Napoleon purchased Louisiana was to essentially support the sugar colonies. Well, if he loses Haiti, which is the kind of crown jewel of these colonies, maybe no longer a lot of interest in Louisiana anymore. And so on the one hand, Jefferson is publicly denouncing the Haitian Revolution, as he must, but he refuses French requests to halt American trade with the rebels. So American merchants, not because they have any sympathy for the Haitian Revolution per se, but because they have sympathy with the almighty dollar, are supplying the revolutionaries. They're selling them, weapons and supplies. And so Jefferson kind of looks the other way while this happens, right? He's on the one hand saying this revolution is bad, but on the other hand, he's not stopping the flow of arms and equipment that's making it possible. And the effect is by 1804, the rebels succeed. And even before then, Napoleon is losing patience with Haiti, right? He says, damn sugar, damn coffee, damn colonies. He's just pouring money and treasure and lives into Haiti. And it increasingly comes to see as not worth it, right? And this is, again, largely the credit of the Haitian rebels. But Jefferson plays his own game here by ensuring that those rebels have access to a steady source of American supplies to keep their war up. Second thing that Jefferson does to help facilitate this purchase is orders the removal of a large number of Native American nations from the Midwest, and he sends them packing across the Mississippi into French territory. Now, the forcible relocation of Native peoples is obviously not a new story, but in this case, in addition to firming up U.S. control of the Midwest, Jefferson also hopes that by relocating a lot of now very angry and upset Indian nations in French territory, essentially saying, you deal with them now, right? Like we've stripped these people of their land and kicked them out of our country, and we've left them in your backyard to deal with now, right? And that creates another headache for Napoleon and the French. Finally, Jefferson sought and obtained permission from Congress to build a fleet of gunboats and raise an army of 80,000 men to patrol the Mississippi River and the border with what was then French territory. This is a not so subtle signal to the French the United States would use military force if necessary to secure access to the Mississippi River. So we have covert aid to rebels in Haiti, proxy warfare using forcibly displaced Native Americans, and gunboat diplomacy in the Mississippi River. Jefferson is no country rube who just sort of stumbles into Louisiana. He made it happen through an activist, expansionist foreign policy that ended up outmaneuvering Napoleon himself, right? Napoleon is turning his attention back to Europe and eventually decides that, the cost of New World empire and dealing with Haitian rebels and the pesky Americans and, angry Native Americans just aren't worth it. And so decides to sell in order to turn his attention back to Europe, right? Thus, Jefferson is able to make good on his desire for an expanded empire for liberty, and without firing a shot, is able to basically double the size of the United States in 1803. Now, within the context of Jeffersonian expansion, I want to talk briefly about two gentlemen named Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, who you've probably heard of. Lewis and Clark were a lot of things. Their story is usually discussed as this kind of amazing voyage of kind of exploration and discovery, beginning in St. Louis, Missouri, you see there, and you follow that kind of red line, and it takes them all the way out to the West Coast into Oregon and the mouth of the Columbia River by 1806. You probably have heard or been told at some point that they brought along with them a Native American woman named Sacagawea, who, along with her husband, a French fur trapper, and her child, helped guide the Lewis and Clark expedition on their way to the coast. They also stopped along the way at a number of Native American villages, and in a kind of way that was uncharacteristic for Americans. followed the kind of more Spanish approach of living among these Native American villages, particularly over the winter time, right? It's largely out of necessity. They're a small group, they need assistance, and so they would stop along the way and meet groups such as the Mandans. Lewis and Clark had something else in common with the Spanish conquistadors, though, and that is that in spite of whatever kind of discovery or cultural encounters they're having along the way, the purpose of this voyage was not to be some sort of cultural exchange program with indigenous peoples. Yes, there was exploration, but it was exploration with a purpose. Like the Spanish conquistadors, Lewis and Clark were the shock troops of an expanding empire. They were sent to map the region that Jefferson had purchased from France in preparation for the arrival of future white settlers who would eventually displace or exterminate groups such as the Mandans. They were also there to expand the boundaries of the U.S. empire. And in fact, part of their mission was not simply to map out this Louisiana Purchase, but to go beyond that, to go to the West Coast and to plant the U.S. flag on the West Coast in order to plant a kind of U.S. claim for that territory, which was being disputed between the British, who were coming down from Canada, the Russians, who were coming down from Siberia, and Americans who were beginning to spill west. Lewis and Clark were thus best seen, I would argue, as the kind of forward wedge of an expanding American empire under Thomas Jefferson. Oh, actually, go off script here a bit. I'm going to pause it right there. Okay. So the exploitation and conquest of this empire continued long after Jefferson. Before he's president, Andrew Jackson was famous not only for killing people in duels, but for leading a series of wars against Native Americans, including the Seminoles in Florida and the Creeks in Georgia. And as president in 1835, Jackson presided over the forcible removal of the Cherokee Nation and other Native American tribes. Right, so Jefferson starts this process, right, of purchasing Louisiana and pushing west, and those who follow after him employ military and vigilante force to forcibly remove any Native inhabitants to this territory. Right, this is again an old story in many ways. It begins with the British colonization, but it's one that continues to expand westward in the aftermath of Jefferson's presidency. So I want to move on to the War of 1812, which is part of the continual theme of U.S. territorial expansion. The origins of this war, which pitted the United States against the British, were complicated, and they involved, among other things, assuring American access to free trade on the high seas. I'm not really going to get into that today. But one of the deciding factors, one of the things that pushed the United States into war with Britain in 1812, was the fact that many white Americans living on the frontier region around the Great Lakes believed that the British outposts that were stationed around the Great Lakes, remember, so the Great Lakes, shares a border with Canada, which is British, and so there's all kinds of British outposts there. And white American settlers believe that the British are secretly conspiring with Native peoples and supplying them and encouraging them to attack white settlers, right? So you have here in this cartoon, right, of the British person offering money in exchange for American scalps, right? The reality is, while there was some cooperation between the British and Native peoples, that it wasn't like Native peoples around the Great Lakes needed British help or encouragement to dislike white settlers who were taking their land, right? This is a very simplistic view of, the British put them up to it. But Americans believe this, and they think we need to go to war with Britain, both to protect our shipping on the high seas, which again, given the nature of given how much time we have today, I'm not going to go into that. You could look up that part of the War of 1812 if you're interested. But primarily in the West, in order to remove both indigenous peoples and also those British fortifications around the Great Lakes and free up the way for untrammeled American expansion, right? So it's with that in mind, the United States declares war against Great Britain, and the Americans had envisioned a quick victory over not just the Great Lakes region, but also over sparsely populated British Canada. And the idea is that they're going to actually invade Canada, kick out the British, and also all of their Indian allies. Instead of a quick victory, however, the British, with their Indian allies, defeated the Americans decisively. They thwarted the invasion of Canada. And ironically, the most decisive effect of the American attacks was to strengthen the formation of a Canadian identity and a determination never to be invaded or absorbed by the United States. The U.S. does win a handful of naval battles around the Great Lakes region, but these are offset by embarrassing defeats on the East Coast. The U.S. Cannot control the Atlantic coast. The Royal Navy essentially blockades and controls the entire Atlantic coastline, shutting off all trade. And the British actually invade and burn Washington to the ground in 1814, forcing James Madison and his government to flee the city while the White House is put up in flames, right? Again, I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow account of this war, but you don't have to be like a super general to know that when the enemy occupies your capital and burns it to the ground, that's usually a sign that your war effort is not going particularly well. Despite these very embarrassing setbacks, the United States did manage to avoid complete defeat at the hands of the British. And crucially, the British themselves were tired of war at this point. They'd been fighting Napoleon in Europe already for quite some time. And Britain simply didn't have the kind of resources or energy to muster the forces they would need to actually invade and occupy the United States, right? They had tried and failed to do that during the Revolution when things were much more favorable to them. There's just no way Britain is going to be able to actually conquer all of the United States and hold it. And with the Napoleonic Wars winding down in Europe, both sides decide to come to an agreement. And so a peace agreement is reached. And as part of the settlement, the British agreed to formally dismantle their fortifications in the West, which had helped bar American expansion, and to cut off all ties with the Native American tribes and nations who are resisting American settlers. Once again, as in the Revolutionary War, it was Native Americans who came out as the biggest losers, essentially, in this conflict, right? That even the British, who had been allied with them, said, nope, not our problem, right? And one of the most important consequences of the War of 1812 was to dismantle some of the few remaining barriers to American expansion in the West. Combination of the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, the withdrawal of the British forts after the War of 1812, and then a series of military actions against Indian tribes such as the Creek and the Cherokee. Most famous probably being Andrew Jackson and the removal of the Cherokee Nation on the so-called Trail of Tears from 1835 to 1839. Americans are consolidating control over these newly occupied territories and essentially replacing indigenous people with white settlers, right? Repeating a pattern we've already seen. This process of continued territorial expansion is often summed up in two words, and those two words are manifest destiny. This was a term coined in 1845 by a Democratic newspaper editor by a guy named William O'Sullivan, who declared, "Our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." So manifest destiny has an ideological component, including the belief in white and specifically white Anglo-Saxon supremacy, as well as the conviction that God had chosen the American people for a special destiny. Right. It also had a more practical component, including the hunger of white American settlers for land, as well as of merchants and industrialists for more markets to trade in. And the combined result of this is a growing confidence among white Americans by the mid-19th century that the entire American continent, at least the North American continent, was to be in the exclusive possession of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. As I've noted for you on numerous occasions, race is itself a social fiction that has little or no basis in biology, right? The genetic differences between the races are so tiny to be meaningless. Biologically, in all the ways that matter, we're all the same. But also, as you know, if you paid attention in this class, as a social construct, however fictional it may be, race has played and continues to play an incredibly important role in American history. On all of these trends, the desire for land and trade, combined with the conviction of white racial superiority and a belief that the United States was chosen by God for a special destiny, came together dramatically in the years 1845 to 1848. In that short time, um, the size of the United States grew by nearly 70%. Right now, again, the idea of expansion, the idea of white supremacy, the idea that God had allotted this continent for white Americans, these are not new. But the 1840s was second only to the presidency of Thomas Jefferson in the sheer amount of territory added to the United States. And the key player here is a guy named James Knox Polk, James K. A Tennessee Democrat and a protege of Andrew Jackson. Polk is elected in 1844 on a platform that called for vigorous westward expansion. Polk was similar to Jackson in that respect, and you could really draw in many ways a kind of straight line from Jefferson to Jackson to Polk as heirs to the expansionist consensus in American politics. All three of these men believed that territorial expansion was necessary in order to provide more land so that white men could own their own farms and homesteads. What made Polk different from his predecessors in this respect was that he did not simply want land or territory for the sake of having land or territory. More land's good, obviously, for all the reasons I already outlined, relating to republicanism and the size of the republic and all that. But Polk also had something else in mind. And here I'm going to give you a brief flashback to the morning of February 22nd, 1784, just coincidentally the birthday of George Washington. On that morning, an American vessel financed by a group of New York and Philadelphia merchants left New York Harbor carrying 30 tons of ginseng in addition to wine, silver, and other products. Name of the ship is the Empress of China, which sort of gives away what its mission was, which was to open trade between the newly created American nation, which was less than 6 months old, formally speaking, at this point, and China. After a voyage of 18,000 miles and 128 days, the Empress of China arrives in China, where its crew traded the ginseng and other goods in exchange for tea, gold, silk, and porcelain. And then it completes its journey back to New York in May of 1785, where its cargo helped the investors who financed the voyage reap a healthy profit. Now, the significance of this voyage was to open up American trade to China. This is not particularly a large trade at first. It's a very long voyage, but the British, the Dutch, and the Portuguese had already kind of started to control the Chinese market, right? They'd had a much longer head start on trade with China and had wrapped up a number of exclusive agreements. So initially, American trade is small. But Americans have their eye on this Chinese market, and they look and they say, look, there's this huge market of, at the time, millions, will become billions of people, who have things that we would like, and also we can sell them our stuff, right? And so over the years that follow, the United States begins to expand its entrees into Asia. Andrew Jackson helps pave the way for American both economic and territorial expansion. By sending an emissary to sign treaties with a country then known as Siam, now Thailand, as well as other countries in Southeast Asia. And then Polk's predecessor, the guy who was in office before him, John Tyler, sent an envoy to China to negotiate a treaty by which the United States would automatically receive what's called most favored nation status with Chinese trade, meaning when America trades with China, we would automatically get whatever terms were given to their best diplomatic contact, right? So essentially a way of securing good access to the Chinese market for American merchants and business people. Now, the problem with this, the big problem with American access to trade with China and more broadly with Asia, right? China is a kind of fixation in the American imagination because of the size of its market, but more broadly the Asian market. The big problem with that is if you look at this map of the world around the time that Polk takes office, is America only has ports on the East Coast, and that means any American trade with China has to go all the way down and around the coast of South America and then back up to Asia. And this is where Polk comes into our story. Because Polk's idea is to combine the trend of territorial expansion on the North American continent with this quest for access to Asian markets. And specifically, he has his eyes on 3 deep water ports on the West Coast. The Puget Sound area, so the area around Vancouver and Seattle, San Francisco, and San Diego, right? What these have in common is they are what we would call deep water ports, sort of large natural places where you can easily set up, docks where ships can come in, even heavily loaded ships can come in and dock and be harbored and act as essentially trading ports where ships can depart for Asia and then return with their cargo and then unload them. Right? So these deep water ports of the West Coast. This is what Polk wants. Problem is that when Polk takes office in 1844, none of these are in American hands. The Puget Sound is disputed between the United States and Great Britain, and both San Francisco and San Diego are in the hands of a newly independent Mexico. And so it's Polk's mission to get these ports for the United States. And I'll start by telling you the story of Oregon first and the Puget Sound, because it's relatively simple. You see there in that map in the top left, the Puget Sound area and the kind of cities like Seattle and a little further north, Vancouver. Under the terms of an 1827 treaty, what was called the Oregon Territory was jointly occupied by Britain and the United States. And at first, American settlers were vastly outnumbered by the British. But as was usually the case, over time, this imbalance tipped gradually in favor of the Americans as more and more Americans flow across the Oregon Trail there and settle the area around Oregon and Washington. And by the time Polk takes office, Americans now outnumber the British in this area. Following a pattern that he's going to later repeat with Mexico, Polk first offers to deal peacefully with the British. And he said, let's split the Oregon Territory with everything below a particular latitude line, right? He chooses 49 degrees latitude, which is that line you see, that kind of center line where it says line of 184, line of 181. He initially suggests, let's do this. Let's do this. We'll split it here. Britain gets that, and then the United States gets access to, ports around Seattle. When the British refuse, they were not going to take this deal. Polk gets angry and he threatens war. And he says, okay, you're not going to do that deal? Then you know what? We're going to take it all. And the slogan becomes 54-40 or fight. And that, if you look at that map there on your right, you see the lines of the line 54-40 line. He says, you know what? You guys don't want to sell it to us. We'll fight. We'll take it all. Ultimately, the fact that he's also preparing for a war with Mexico here, and the fact that Britain really doesn't want to fight either, leads to a compromise. And so they agree. Britain and the United States eventually agree without a war that, okay, well, fine, we'll go back to this original proposal. We'll go back to this 49th degree latitude, and we'll sign a treaty. And the result is in 1846, the U.S. had without fired a shot added harbors in the Puget Sound, along with a bunch of new land that contained an abundance of natural resources. Oregon and what will become Oregon and Washington gets added to the Union. Now, the second element in Polk's plan was California, right? Because California is where those ports of San Francisco and San Diego are. And that ended up with Polk taking something of a detour by way of Mexico City. And to understand the Mexican-American War, which was arguably the most significant development of Polk's presidency and a sort of huge event that had lingering effects, not just for the United States, but for Mexico. You need to understand a little bit about the history of the US and Mexico leading up to the 1840s. So what you see here is Mexico at the time of its independence in 1821, right? So Mexico had been a Spanish colony, and in 1821, Mexico wins its independence. At the time of independence, only about 1% of the Mexican population, or about 800,000 people, lived north of the Rio Grande River, right? And we sort of talked about, early in this course about why that was, right? That the early colonization and conquest of Central and South America focuses on areas around the Aztec and Inca empires, and they. The Spanish eventually decided really it's not worth expanding north into this territory here. It's not worth our while. This poses a problem, though, for the newly independent Mexican government in that they have all of this land that they claim, right? But it's relatively sparsely populated. And also, the indigenous people who live on that land, the Indian nations who live on this land, do not recognize Mexican rule. And so there's constant tensions between the central government of Mexico and the native peoples who live on this land. And the Mexican government decides that if we want to continue to claim this land, we need to populate it. We need to put more people here into this sparsely populated land in order to solidify our claim on it. So in 1823, the Mexican government made a fateful decision. And it started by opening the area that we now know as Texas to American immigration. And the Mexican government told white American immigrants that they were welcome to come into Texas and settle the land, so long as they agreed to abide by the rules of the Mexican government. Right? So you come in here, you're gonna live within the borders of Mexico. You can settle this land, but you got to live by our rules. Very quickly, land-hungry Americans are streaming over the border into Texas, populating the region, and increasingly turning the area around Texas into an American enclave within Mexico. By 1835, the Mexican government realized that they had made a mistake, and that if American settlers were not stopped, they would soon take over the whole region. What's worse, many of these Americans who had come into Texas had brought their enslaved people with them, and slavery is actually illegal under Mexican law, but the American settlers are flouting the law and coming in and essentially taking over Texas. So in 1835, the Mexican government tries to close the border to white settlers and to enforce an 1829 law that emancipated all slaves. Closing that border proved to be very, very difficult. And eventually, tensions between the white Texas residents and the Mexican government escalate to the point of open warfare. On one side of this battle, we have white American settlers and Texans who are allied with a group known as the Tejanos, who are native-born Texans of Mexican descent. So people who are of Mexican descent, but they're born in Texas. And they have a kind of separate identity in many ways from other parts of Mexico. And the Tejanos share in common with the Texans distrust and dislike of the central Mexican government. They would rather be able to run their own affairs rather than be directed from the Mexican central government. So on one side, we have the Texans and the Tejanos rising up to try to claim independence for Texas. On the other hand, we have the Mexican government led by a guy named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. The most famous battle of the Texican War for Independence took place at the mission of San Antonio de Valero, also known as the Alamo, in March of 1836, where a force of 188 Texans and Tejanos stood off 3,000 Mexican troops for 12 days. They lost the battle eventually, but the fact that they held out for as long as they did became a kind of a rallying cry. Remember the Alamo becomes a rallying cry. And eventually the Texans and the Tejano allies defeat Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836. After the Texans win their independence, the American settlers living in the newly independent Republic of Texas quickly took control over much of the government, displacing the native Tejano elite with whom they allied during the war. It became essentially a white person's country. And this new Texan government looked to the United States for protection and hoped to join the Union, right? The idea was that, not to have an independent Texas forever, because that really wasn't super tenable. In order to get the kind of military protection they needed, this new republic wanted to join the United States. That was easier said than done, particularly because there were fears among many anti-slavery advocates in the North, and we'll talk about this sort of lead up to the Civil War a week or two, about adding yet another slave states. And so attempts to annex Texas were shot down in 1837, and then again in 1844. And it actually took an extraordinary move by President John Taylor in his very last days in office, to annex Texas by resorting to a simple joint resolution of Congress. It's kind of a sort of trick way to do it, but does in 1845 add Texas to the Union. Now, the American annexation of Texas understandably upset Mexico. Not only had they lost a significant part of their territory to their aggressive neighbor to the north, but there remained a kind of lingering dispute over exactly where the border is, right? You can see here that the area in this map that's shaded orange and green was an area that was disputed by the United States and Mexico. It's worth noting, though, that all of this took place, all this Texan War for Independence and the annexation took place before Polk took office. And while there's obviously sort of residual lingering tensions from this affair, there was no immediate crisis with Mexico when Polk takes office in 1845. And if the new president had been willing to exercise some tact, maybe arrange for a payment to Mexico as restitution for the annexation of Texas, this almost certainly could have been resolved without recourse to war. Polk, however, is not thinking about Texas or about improving relations with Mexico. He's thinking instead about California and about those lovely deep water ports, right? Particularly San Diego and San Francisco. And with that in mind, Polk, after he takes office, dispatches a mission to Mexico with an offer to buy New Mexico and California for $30 million. Right? Hey, we want this territory. We want access to these ports. To get the ports, we need the territory, which we could also actually use. We'll give you $30 million for it. Mexico, who had just been stung by the Texan Revolution and the American annexation, wants no part of this, right? They've already lost all the territory. They have no desire to sell this territory to Polk. Rather than trying to work this out peacefully, Polk decides on a deliberate strategy of provocation. So he orders American troops under the command of General Zachary Taylor to march into this disputed territory around the Rio Grande and to set up camp there. And in doing so, Polk knew one of two things is going to happen. Either the Mexican government would be intimidated by the show of force, and they would give in and agree to sell California. Oh, please don't hurt us. Right? Or the Mexicans would attack these American troops who are on, again, territory claimed by Mexico. In which case, the United States would be at war with Mexico, and Polk would have license then to take California by force. Right? Polk is going to get California one way or another. And, ideally, he would have preferred to avoid war, right? He'd rather just buy the territory. But if war is what's going to take, that's what he's going to do. And Polk gets his war when Mexican forces attack U.S. troops who had moved into disputed territory that, again, the Mexicans say, this is our land. You have your troops on our land. And so we are going to attack you because you are in our territory. That makes the fact that the Mexicans attack American troops makes it a lot easier for Polk, though, right? Because he can claim, "Oh, I'm just waging a defensive war, right? I didn't fire the first shot. We're defending ourselves here." So Polk gets his war. It's called Mr. Polk's War because it's kind of widely known at the time that this is kind of what he wants to do, right? Um, However, this war does not go as planned, either politically or militarily, for Polk in the United States. Now, the vast majority of Americans support the war with Mexico, but a vocal minority oppose this war, both in Congress and in the press. And there's kind of two lines of opposition upon which this opposition forms. And the first had to do with anti-slavery forces in the North. And there were those in the North who were opposed to the expansion of slavery, who saw this entire war as a ploy by Southern slaveholders to extend the area of slavery, just as they had in Texas, right? And so relatively quickly, the Mexican War gets caught up in this sectional debate about slavery. And so those in the North who oppose the war, not having to do anything with the ports or California, but just simply saying, what I see here is a ploy to expand the domain of slavery. Opposition to the war also stemmed from the way in which it had begun, particularly among so-called Whigs. You'll remember that when I talked about the second party system, that's Andrew Jackson, the Democrats, and the opposition party is one called the Whigs. And many Whigs believe that the president had maneuvered the United States into war under false pretenses, which he did. So Polk goes to Congress and he asks for a declaration of war, and there are those in Congress who are suspicious, and they say, "Hey, can you show us proof that U.S. troops were actually on U.S. soil and not in either disputed or Mexican territory? Because that makes a difference, right? Like if we're in Mexican territory, they're in the right to attack us. So we want proof." And Polk claims that, "Oh yeah, I got these documents for you. I can prove this, but they're at the printers right now. So just go ahead and vote and we'll get you the documents later," right? Which is not the kind of tactic that endeared him to those who distrust him. One of the more vocal opponents of the war with Mexico was a young Whig named, who served in the House of Representatives, named Abraham Lincoln, who wrote to his friend and fellow law partner in 1848, "Allow the president to invade a neighboring nation whenever he shall deem it necessary to repel an invasion. And you allow him to do so whenever he may choose to say he deems it necessary for such a purpose. And you allow him to make war at pleasure. Study to see if you can fix any limit to his power in this respect, after you have given so much. You may say to him, I see no probability of the British invading us. But he will say, be silent. I see it if you don't." This is a kind of debate over executive authority, right? That should we allow the president to just say, "Hey, I see a threat out there somewhere. I should be allowed to take military action." And Lincoln says, "No, that we should have proof, right? We should not go to war lightly." Right? This is a debate over executive authority and foreign policy and war making that obviously has not gone away, right? You saw it most notably in the war in Iraq, where similar claims were made. There are those who went even further in their opposition to the war. The Boston Atlas, which is an American newspaper based out of Boston, was so opposed to the war that they wrote an editorial that said it would be a sad and woeful joy, but a joy nevertheless, to hear that the hordes under Generals Scott and Taylor, and that's Generals Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, were every man of them swept into the next world. Right, so here we have an American newspaper saying, "I hope all these American troops die." This is not a majority sentiment by any means, but it shows the extent to which this is a very divisive war, right? That even though there's a majority support from the war, there's a very, very vocal minority opposed to this war. I mean, imagine sentiments like this. You can't even on the furthest anti-war sentiments you can imagine. You're not going to see a newspaper publishing something that I hope all American troops in Afghanistan or Iraq die. And yeah, this is being published in an American newspaper. Now, none of this political stuff would have mattered particularly much if the war had gone as planned militarily and it ended in a quick Mexican surrender. That had been the plan, right? A quick war. It's always the plan, right? Like no one ever starts a war and says this is going to drag on for years and cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. So this war's going to be over quickly, right? That was the plan. But there, things don't go exactly Polk's way. For one thing, some of the most effective practical opposition to the war came not from politicians or from Boston newspaper editorials, but from American soldiers themselves, many of whom did not enjoy being on the blunt end of manifest destiny. 23-year-old lieutenant in the American Army by the name of Ulysses S. Grant, whom you're going to be hearing quite a lot about after Thanksgiving, described the Mexican War as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker nation, an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies in not considering justice in their desire to acquire additional territory. He went on to say, I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States in Mexico. I thought so at the time when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage enough to resign. Now, Grant was an officer at this period, but the most dramatic opposition to the war came not from officers like Grant, but rather from the enlisted men of the United States Army who did the bulk of the fighting. As would be the case in the Civil War 15 years later, the ranks of the American Army were largely filled by poor people and by immigrants. Almost half of the U.S. enlisted men in the American Army in Mexico were foreign-born. Right? Foreign-born. Again, not like descended from, like my dad was an immigrant, but people who were born in another country and were first-generation immigrants make up something about half of the enlisted men. And about 25% of those were Irish. The desertion rate was staggering. And most American soldiers who didn't like the fighting registered their displeasure simply by refusing to fight at all, right? So 13% of the regular Army soldiers deserted during the war, just walked away, right? And again, contrast that with Vietnam, kind of the most unpopular recent-ish war in American history, and the desertion rate there was 4.1%. Most of these deserters simply slipped out of camp and ran away, right? The United States is a big country, it's easy to hide. Some, however, actually crossed over and fought for the Mexican side. They were encouraged by leaflets that were distributed by the Mexican side saying, hey, like, this is an unjust war, you're fighting for an unjust cause, you're fighting for a racist nation, desert and come over and join us, right? And the most famous group of American deserters who ended up fighting for the Mexican side was the so-called San Patricio Battalion. This was a group of Americans who literally switched sides, went from the US Army to the Mexican Army. And while the battalion actually had in it people of many different backgrounds, as you can imagine from the name, the majority of them were made up of Irish immigrants to the United States. Now, at this time, the Irish were kind of the lowest rung on the immigrant ladder, right? They were still above slaves and Black people. But in terms of white immigrants, the Irish were looked upon as uncivilized, as unassimilable, right? As like, hey, all these other immigrants, all these other white immigrants, we can assimilate. But the Irish, they're too brutish and nasty and violent. It was not uncommon to see newspaper characters of the Irish as apes. And many Irish immigrants, when they came to the United States, enlisted in the Army simply because they were poor and could find no other work. The Irish, both in the military and out, were frequently the targets of abuse because of the fact they were Catholic. And so they are both ethnic minorities. And again, nowadays, being Irish, saying, oh, I'm an Irish American, like I'm descended from Irish folks, right? I'm an Irish American. That's just a kind of quaint thing you say. At this time, it meant something, right? Being Irish, particularly being a direct Irish immigrant, meant you were going to get treated kind of shitty. And you're also a religious minority because America is a majority Protestant nation, and you're Catholic. And religious tensions were pretty sharp in this time period. Um, Many Irish soldiers were treated absolutely brutally by their commanding officers, right? They were whipped, they were beaten, and many of them found they had actually much more sympathy with the Mexicans than they did with their own officers, right? Many Mexicans are also Mexico's also a majority Catholic nation, and so this group of deserters actually leaves the American ranks, about 200 to 300 of them. It's not a huge number, right? They left the American ranks and they founded the San Patricio Battalion. They carried a flag that had on green silk, and on one side it said "Libertad por la República Mexicana," liberty for the Mexican Republic, and had the Mexican coat of arms. And on the other side, it had the Irish coat of arms and Erin go Bragh, Ireland forever. They were led by a man named Captain John Riley, who declared, "Be not deceived by the prejudice of a nation that is at war with Mexico. For a friendlier and more hospitable people than the Mexicans, you will not find on the face of earth." By all accounts, the San Patricios fought bravely and skillfully on the Mexican side, but the bulk of the battalion was eventually captured after the Battle of Churubusco in September of 1847. 50 men from the battalion were hanged, and the rest were flogged and branded on the face with the letter D for deserter. There is a memorial today still to the San Patricios in San Jacinto Plaza in what is now Mexico City. And if you go twice a year, there are celebrations there attended by the Mexican and Irish ambassadors, both on St. Patrick's Day and then on September 12th on the anniversary of the hangings. So again, this is a relatively small number of people, but again, it's illustrative of the tensions, not just of the war, but within American society. I mean, again, imagine, imagine Americans not simply deserting the military, but literally going to fight for the other side. Now, none of this would have been a huge deal if the war had gone as planned and ended quickly. Right? And at first it seemed like that might happen. So you see here, this is a map showing the American advances, right? Regular army troops under the command of General Taylor won relatively quick victories at the outset of the war, battles at Palo Alto, Resaca de Palma. And in the months afterwards, Taylor's army begins to march south and wins a series of battles, culminating in taking the city of Monterrey, right? Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy sails around to California, and they operate up and down the coast and seize the ports of San Diego and Los Angeles. Right? And militarily, everything seems to be going pretty well for the United States in the early phases of this war. There's one problem. The Mexicans weren't surrendering. They were losing all these battles, and they were losing a lot of territory, but the Mexican government is not surrendering. Enter our old friend, Santa Anna, who has been in exile in Cuba. And in 1846, as the war breaks out, and he sort of sees what's happening, he sees the Mexican government is losing, but it's not surrendering. He contacts the United States, and he says, "Hey, look, you get me back in, you let me back into the country, right? You get me through U.S. lines, get me to Mexico. I'll take charge. I know guys there. I'll take charge of the war effort, and I will end the war, and I'll sell California." Right? And the U.S. government agrees to this. They allow him to go back to Mexico. He gets to Mexico City, and he says, "Thanks, suckers." And instead, he coordinates a continued Mexican resistance to the American war effort. The result is increasingly looks like if Polk is going to get what he wants, if he's going to get California, he's actually going to have to conquer and defeat all of Mexico. Right? I mean, he sort of hoped that a couple quick victories and the Mexicans would give up and at least sell California. Now it's looking like it's going to be a war that encompasses all of Mexico, and it's going to go on for quite some time. So while General Taylor is pushing to push south, there's a second force under General Winfield Scott, which conducted an amphibious landing at the city of Veracruz, and then begins a long and bloody march towards Mexico City, which culminates in September of 1847 with the fall of Mexico City and its occupation by the American Army. Problem. The Mexican government still will not surrender. Santa Anna escapes, remains at large, and still controls a military force that is waging constant guerrilla attacks on increasingly overstretched U.S. supply lines between Mexico City and Veracruz. And for a brief moment, it looks like the United States is going to get sucked into this potentially like decades or generations long kind of guerrilla war, where the Mexican government won't surrender, won't give up, and the Americans continue to occupy it, right? And it is here that we come to one of the oddest moments in the history of all of American diplomacy. And it's a story I think worth telling, not only because it's interesting in and of itself, but because like the story of poor old Thomas Hutchinson, it illustrates the importance of individuals in history, right? You know, much of the trends we talk about in this class are kind of larger structural trends, whether it's you know, slavery or white supremacy or capitalism or gender or you know, westward expansion. All these things are kind of larger trends that don't depend on any one person. But there are moments in history where one person makes a tremendous difference, and this is one of them. Polk is anxious for this war to end as quickly as possible, right? He wants, because, you know, he's got all his problems at home. He's got his opponents to the war. He's got dissension in the military. And so he wants to end it as quickly as possible. And so even before the fall of Mexico City, he had decided that he would dispatch a diplomatic envoy that would travel along with the troops so that peace could be negotiated the minute that the time seemed right. Right, so that, you know, rather than waiting for, hey, the Mexican government says they're ready to surrender, okay, we'll send an emissary down from Washington. He literally sends somebody to go along with the troops who's ready to negotiate the surrender as soon as the Mexicans can be convinced to do it. Now, you can't very well send an important cabinet officer like the Secretary of State on this kind of extended, open-ended mission, right? Because you don't know how long it's going to last. You got to send this guy into enemy territory, so you're not going to send your Secretary of State. And instead, he sends this relatively unknown guy from the State Department named Nicholas Trist. He's basically just a clerk. He's a State Department clerk. And clerk's mission is to travel along with General Winfield Scott's troops as they advance to Mexico City, and then be there to cut the surrender deal when the time comes. Trist's mission immediately gets started on a bad foot because General Scott does not appreciate having a diplomat along for the ride. And he sends Trist an angry letter, basically saying, hey, don't meddle with me. Like, I'm in charge here. This is a military operation. Don't fuck with it. Trist, rather than responding diplomatically, replies with a bitter, angry 30-page letter of his own, defending his mission and himself. So not a great start. Things get worse when Trist starts to negotiate with Santa Anna. So Trist gets the idea that he's going to bribe Santa Anna, that he's going to give him $10,000. And in exchange for that $10,000, Santa Anna will agree to make peace with the United States, right? Buy him off. So Santa Anna hears his offer. He says, you know what? That's a deal. That sounds like a really good deal. Give me the $10,000 and we'll make peace. Chris gives him the $10,000. Santa Anna says, see you later, sucker. Again, take your money and use it to fund the war effort. So after this, Polk decides, you know what, this Trist guy is not working out, and I'm gonna bring him home. And so he sends a letter to Trist saying, you got to come home. Forget it. Polk at this point also feels like, you know what, I've taken Mexico City at this point. I'm in a much stronger position, and I'm not satisfied with just California or the Southwest anymore. That I'm gonna negotiate for large chunks of Mexico. So Trist, come home, forget your original mission. I'll send somebody else later, and we're going to extract much more territory from Mexico. Trist then does something unusual. He refuses to go home. He sees, you know, from his perch in Mexico City that the Mexican government is falling apart, and that if he doesn't strike a deal now, there's pretty much not going to be a government to negotiate with much longer. And without a formal government that could surrender, the United States would be left essentially to occupy and police Mexico by itself, which means constant low-level guerrilla warfare. So Chris says, you know what? I'm not going to go home. He writes a 65-page letter to Polk in which he refuses the president's order to return. And then he sits down and he hammers out a treaty with what's left of the Mexican government, by which the United States, this is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, concluded in February of 1848. The United States under this treaty gets 500,000 miles of Mexican territory. You see it labeled there, Mexican Session 1848, including present-day California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and parts of Colorado, in exchange for $15 million. Now, Polk is pissed the fuck off. He's super upset that his own emissary had not only refused to return, but had negotiated a treaty without permission. Right? Because Polk had revoked Chris' authority to negotiate. He said, you know what? Your original thing was to buy the Southwest, California, whatever. I'm revoking that. I want all of Mexico, large parts of Mexico. And Polk is angry. He actually thinks about arresting Chris when he returns to Washington. He ends up just firing for insubordination instead. Nevertheless, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo arrives in Washington, it actually helps to extract Polk from a difficult political situation. On the one side, Polk is being hounded by anti-war Whigs, who are threatening to cut off funding for the war, and on the other hand, by expansionist Southern leaders who want literally all of Mexico because they want to expand the domain of slavery and make all of Mexico a slave state, which Polk thinks might be a little much to bite off and chew, right? And so Frist essentially presents Polk with an offer he can't refuse. He can't very well. I mean, he went to war for California and parts of the Southwest, and now it's all being given to him for $15 million, which is half of what he was originally going to pay for it. So he can't very well turn it down, and so he reluctantly accepts the treaty, and the war with Mexico is over. And again, this is sort of the importance of contingency and of individuals. If Trist had done as he was told and simply come home, it's highly likely that the Mexican government would have collapsed before a new emissary arrived. And it also would have bought time for those who wanted to seize all of Mexico and an excuse for all of those who wanted to seize all of Mexico to do that. And it's quite likely the United States would have occupied all of Mexico for decades, if not generations. As it was, Trist's treaty at least temporarily cooled political tensions and ended the war. Now, I know this is a long lecture, but I'm just going to give you a few more minutes here on the war's aftermath, and then we'll wrap it. Because the war's aftermath had tremendous implications for both nations, for both the United States and Mexico, and particularly for those living in what is now the Southwest of the United States. Thanks to this new treaty, the United States now possessed a huge chunk of new territory, which was already occupied by what were now former Mexican citizens, some of whom have been living there for generations. Again, it's sparsely populated, but it is populated. And for the folks who lived there, they went to bed one night as Mexican citizens, and then they wake up the next morning in occupied territory. And so there's this notion that you'll hear expressed in particularly in the American Southwest by those who are kind of descendants of those who had lived there before the war. Nosotros llegamos primero, we were here first, or we didn't cross the border crossed us, which is literally true. These people were asleep in their beds at night, and then a treaty is signed, and the border changed. Significantly, when the Senate ratified Trist's treaty, it modified it, and it stripped out two elements of this treaty that dealt with the way that the former Mexican citizens, now residents of American territory, would be treated. So Article X, Article 10 of the treaty, said the United States will respect the rights of existing landholders, meaning, any land contracts you had under the former Mexican government will still be valid under the new American rulers, right? So that you don't lose your land just because you don't lose your property, your farm, just because the government changed overnight, right? So the United States government will respect the rights of existing landholders. Article 11, which would respect the political rights of former Mexican citizens living in the area, saying essentially, hey, you get to be fully integrated into this. Now you're in the United States, but you're going to have full citizenship rights. Congress either completely junks or modifies both of those things to make it much more ambiguous as to the status of formerly Mexican citizens would be in this territory. And the practical result was that Mexicans and Native Americans living in this territory were treated more as conquered subjects than they were as citizens. They, in many cases, lost their land and were forced to either work as sharecroppers on their own former land or to flee back across the new Mexican border. Unlike the Louisiana Purchase, where that land relatively quickly entered the Union on equal terms, the residents of the Southwest were treated as second-class citizens, creating a series of inequalities that continue to affect patterns of life in the Southwest today. And so, when you take courses in the Chicano movement and you look at, sort of the Chicano rights movement in the 1960s, much of that activism, particularly in the Southwest, has roots in the kind of second-class status of those who had their rights stripped from them after the war with Mexico. For Polk and the expansionists, this war had a somewhat happier, although still mixed ending. So Polk's plan for using California as a springboard for commercial and eventual territorial expansion across the Pacific did in fact come to fruition. We can fast forward to the morning of July 8, 1853, when American Commodore Matthew Perry arrives with a fleet of 4 warships in Tokyo Bay. Japan was at the time a closed nation that had minimal contact with the outside world. And the United States, eager for trade not only with China, but also with Japan and the other nations of Asia, was there to kick in the door, as it were, using naval forces that would be based on the newly acquired Pacific Coast naval bases. What you're seeing here is essentially the future of American foreign policy. America would increasingly use its power not simply to conquer territory on the North American continent, but also to expand its economic, political, and cultural influences around the world, and particularly into Asia. But impressive as this was, in an imperialist sense, even as the United States is preparing to open the nations of Asia and elsewhere to the great force of American economics and American culture, there are tensions lurking within the Republic itself. Tensions that took many forms, but by the 1850s had come to resolve around slavery. And in many ways, the kind of domestic fallout within American politics of this war actually helped to light the fuse for the Civil War.